Let's get into it. The late c-betting as initial raiser, I added it, but seems obvious. We're not talking about delayed stabbing or delayed probing. That would be more for the caller. Why and when? Well, someone already addressed here, plot twist, you never delay. Well, basically, you don't delay c-bet. Let's say you are an initial raiser and a board comes and you have a very big advantage. Usually, you can just range bet, right? So when boards are very good from a range perspective, we just range bet so we don't have to delay. When the equities get closer together, and especially because in this case, if you play cash games or also if you play tournaments, especially in beginning phases, when the SPR is deep, when the board becomes wetter, in general, you're less interested in investing money in the pot now, as the board can often change in the future. Okay, so the wetter the board, the higher the SPR, the less interested we are in building a pot now, and instead move some of our c-bets to delayed c-bets. Okay, so take in position as initial raiser, the flop comes very dry, king a3, we could just range bet. Make it king 5-4, some connectivity in the low side. Maybe if we were opened from a little bit earlier, there's more connectivity around. We should maybe already include some checking. Make it king 5-4 two-tone. Okay, so even more wet. We will check a little bit more. Make it king 9 or queen 9-8 two-tone. Even more wet, we do more checking, especially when we're out of position. Okay, so what are the downsides of moving hands to delayed c-bets? And in this is also kind of the answer when we should maybe delayed c-bet more, or which hands we pick. We let villain realize its equity. That's obviously a problem. And we increase villain's play ability, right? We give him options. Now, whether this is in theory, in the solver, this is obviously bad. Okay, I think actually I have this in my next slide. Because what a solver does with its realization and granted playability is perfect. Therefore, if possible from an equity advantage, we prefer to just range c-bet and not hand it this opportunity. Okay, but what humans do with their realization and granted playability is not always GTO. Therefore, the more mistakes and information villain gives away, the more we are incentivized to move hands to the late c-bets. Okay, so in theory, it's purely based on the equities and the wetness of the board. In practice, though, if the downsides let villain realize equity and gain villain playability, if people make mistakes, then we could also start moving hands to delay on boards where we could just range c-bet, because then the delay could outperform the EV of range betting. So the more mistakes villain is going to make on a later street, the more EV it is in playing in that line or getting to that street. I'll give you an example. Let's say you play versus a recreational player. This actually happens quite often. And let's say you open in position as initial raiser. He calls. And let's say he has a bet size tell on the turn where he bets half pot with his weak hands and pot with his strong hands. Should we then still range bet on king 7-3? The answer is no. Because basically, if we check, he's going to tell us what he has. That's huge EV gain. Versus half pot, we just never fold. We raise or call. Versus pot, we always fold. But in a solver, it doesn't work like that. So therefore, it's c-bet. So those were the downsides. Also, in terms of hand selection, what I will show you, it lets villain realize its equity. What you will usually see, the hands that move to delay are hands that mind less villain realizing equity. So those are hands versus which the folding range of opponent or the continue range of its opponent has less equity because we let him realize to maybe a dominated hand. But I will show you that in practice, in the examples. So upsides of moving hands to delay. We are not building a pot now. We can often lose in the future. This is kind of my point in the beginning. A wet board, we're usually less interested in investing money in the pot now. Villain can realize two or start bluffing with a worse hand than ours. So this is kind of we let villain realize his equity. Well, let's say we have a very dominating hand. We don't mind villain from realizing equity. Or let's say we play versus someone who's over bluffing. Let's go back to the king 7-3 example. And again, this happens versus recreationals. If you have king 8, by all means, just check back. Basically, any two or one street value hand versus recreational, we should usually just check back also on boards versus which we can range bet. Okay, we have to understand why we range betted in the beginning, which was to prevent villain from realizing equity and prevent from giving him playability, and he was going to play perfect. Whereas if the recreational just bluffs 2 street, we should obviously not c-bet king 8. Okay, we should then obviously still c-bet all our weak hands because we don't want to get bluffed. Let's say we have an opponent who doesn't bluff the turn. We can now also move a lot of hands to our delay. And then basically if he bets, we fold, and if he checks, we bet. So I hope also from an exploitative perspective, I'm now kind of opening up your mind to when delayed c-betting could be implemented from a texture and from an exploitative perspective. Another good point, and like I said, especially versus humans who don't balance their ranges as GTO does, villain has already acted, so we have more information about this range. So these are the upsides of delayed c-betting. Now, there's also a difference between playing in position and out of position. And afterwards, we will go into some examples of both in position and out of position, and we will see all these concepts in practice. The biggest difference between being in position and out of position is when we are in position, check means seeing a river, in this case, in the delayed c-bet. But in general, this is just a difference between playing in position and out of position. If you're the in position player, let's say on the flop, you check, you always see the turn. So realization is 100%. Which often leads to a polarized strategy, where out of position, there is the EV comparison of bet, check, check, and check face bet, often leading to a more depolarized betting range. Okay, so for example, if we would just be in position, bet has to outperform the check, it's pretty easy to construct a range. Whereas if you're out of position, we have to compare the EV of check, 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 and face bet, and possible bets that we could face. Okay, so what kind of bet sizing my opponent has? Does he overbet? Does he only bet small? This changes your EV, and this changes the hands that you want to be checking. The out of position player will check more strong hands on the turn compared to how much strong hands in position checks back on the flop. This is everything to do with if you have a strong hand and you're out of position, you're more likely to check because in position can bet and then you can check raise. Whereas if you're in position, checking means you go straight away to the turn. So often in position doesn't really slow play as much because obviously when we have a very strong hand, we want to build a pot. Okay. As for sizing, delayed c-betting, your sizing is often driven by your nut advantage. So if we have a huge nut advantage, we will see very big bets. And thin value, which is mainly going to be out of position / protection needed. Okay. So if villain's folding range has a lot of equity versus our hand, we often like to bet. If both are present, we split between small and big. If none are present, we stick to medium sizing. So if we don't have a nut advantage and there's no clear need for protection or betting thin for value, we usually end up betting around 3/4 pot. Whereas if we want to bet a lot of hands for protection / thin value, you will see a small sizing appear. And if we have the nut advantage, you will see the big sizing. I want to address 2 points on protection because it's a word that's often wrongly used. We can only protect versus hands equity in villain's range that fold to a bet. People often say they want to protect against a flush draw or protect against a straight draw. If those hands call, it's not protection, it's betting for value. So then we have to take its equity that it has versus our hand in consideration. Okay. We can only bet for protection if we get called by worse hands, low enough in equity, enough of the time. I think not one webinar has gone by that I said this. If you want to bet for equity denial, it goes hand in hand with equity when called. Okay, we cannot just bet a hand solely for protection and basically villain folds all worst hand and only calls with better. That's not really a thing. Then we're just purely betting to see where we're at, and that's not really what we're doing. Sizing, we talked about the frequency. Well, the bigger our advantage and the more protection is needed, the higher our frequency and vice versa. But this basically works the same across all spots. Actually, a lot of these concepts are the same across all spots. That's why these are the mechanics. So I've prepared some examples. Anyone have any questions about the mechanics of delayed c-betting before we go into some examples? You now have a better idea of why we do it, when we do it, with what we With what? Not yet. That's what we're going to show you. Sizing. Actually, for the people who saw my last webinar about slow playing, some points will also come back. We talked a lot about how much equity does a folding range have versus our hand. That's something that we will see coming back again. We start off with, is there a general size for nut advantage but no tin value? General size, yes, that's an overbet. So very, very big. We will see that on, for example, an ace-king high board, where a king is not really interested in betting, and we have a nut advantage. Then we'll see a lot of big bets. So let's start off with a 7-6 deuce. For these examples, I went for small blind versus big blind. And afterwards, I'll look at the same boards, but then in position button versus big blind. Okay. So for the people who kind of want to know more about the range construction on the flop, I kind of already explained it a little bit in slow playing, why we check aces, why we always bet 9s and 8s. But basically, these same concepts will again apply on the turn. So this is the flop betting range. And just as for the, like I said, because we're playing small versus big blind, the board can often change in the advantage for the imposition. So let's say there's 2 cards coming out between the 3 and the 9. It's usually very improving for the big blind. So if we look ahead, we can already see that, and we don't want to invest a lot of money in this spot right now. Okay. Therefore, we check and then checks. I want to start off with a turn deuce. I think on all examples I used the flush draw. It's just the more common, right? Than if it's rainbow. Usually, if it's a rainbow turn, we can be a bit more aggressive. Again, wetness decreases, so we can be more aggressive. And we can immediately see that the late c-betting range looks a lot like the flop c-betting range because it's based on the same mechanics. So the big bets, we have another advantage. The deuce doesn't really improve in that much. If we look at the ranges, we are the small blind. We actually have an advantage in like very strong hands. He has a 5 deuce, a 4 deuce, a 3 deuce, a 10 deuce, and a jack deuce suited advantage. So that's very little. And basically, we have a lot of hands in the 80+ region. So we have another advantage. And therefore, we are going to be doing quite a lot of big betting. But also, as you can see here, in this region, the 60-70, so like some ace kings, some pocket 5s, we have an advantage over those hands below. Okay. And this is what we will see back in the strategy. Those hands that we just said, the 60-70% equity, they're here. And you see a lot of orange, which means small bets. Okay. We're getting tin value / a little bit of protection. Okay. Same with pocket 5s, pocket 4s, pocket 3s. And with a 6, we can see similar concepts about which 6 we bet. Obviously, the stronger 6, in this case, the king 6 and the ace 6. And we then start checking with the jack 6. And that's the same reason we check with kings and not with queens. That's everything to do with the folding range. Most probably, if we bet 1/3, the folding range is going to contain a lot of jack x and 10x. And we can see that here. This is of the 22% hands he folds, is like some ace highs and a lot of hands in this region. So therefore, on the turn, we're less interested in folding out some of, like, for example, jack 10 with jack 6. And we're more interested in folding them out with, for example, 7-5 or 6-5 or 8-6. Okay. So protection is needed. Therefore, we have a small sizing together with the nut advantage. Okay. Now, the nut advantage, like I said, if we look at the bigger sizings, they're not huge. I will show you guys an example where it is used. And that's because of the deuce X that is still in there. Also take in consideration, you can play around with this a little bit if you have a custom solver that you can modify. We talked about this in the slow playing section. Why does, for example, in position still check back quite a lot of 7x, for example, 7-9, 7-8, king 7, a7. That's to, remember, handcuff us from going too crazy. So if your opponent bets most 7x and 6x on the flop, our delayed c-bet strategy will look way different. Okay. We can go way thinner for value. So there's basically our bet frequency will go up. We can use bigger bets. We can use smaller bets more often. Okay. Let's look at a 3. There is now some connectivity And not a lot will change. We do see now 175 is a bit more preferred than 125, like I said, because he doesn't have trips now. So especially our overpairs are more interested in putting a lot of money in the pot. Especially again, 9s, 10s, 8s. These hands are sort of the nuts. They're the same hand strength as pocket kings. However, the equity the folding range has is way more versus 8s. Therefore, we bet 8s and check kings. Kings is okay checking and letting him do something funky with jack queen, or letting him hit a jack or a queen. Obviously, 8s is not very interested in that. So if connectivity increases, so let's say it's a 5, we will see the overbets disappear. And in general, we will see our bet sizing decrease. And again, why did we move a lot of hands to the late C bets? I said this is because of the wetness of the board. Someone asked me about when do we go double delay? Well, that's also if the wetness on the turn increases. Again, the wetter the board, the less interested we are in building a pot right now, because the board can often change in the advantage, in this case, of the imposition player. Okay, so therefore we have to slow down and there's no big bets needed. Also, in terms of small bets, like thin value bets, you can see here ace king sometimes squeezes it out, but on the deuce and the 3, we were still thin value betting for protection with some of these hands. Pocket 4s, like more 6x, like king 6, for example. Now we see that significantly decreased. And remember, I talked about protection. Sure, we can still bet for protection and thin value. However, equity when called. Okay, your equity when called has drastically decreased because villains continue range will have more equity on a 5, more pair plus draws, than on, for example, a 3 or a deuce. Okay. So this is a concept that we will constantly see coming back. So we will see the same on, for example, an 8. We will still not see crazy bets. However, we do start overbetting a little bit. And that's because, for example, 9s and 10s, they are kind of the dominating draw. Yes, villain will have a lot of pair plus draws, but 9s and 10s have the dominating draw. So they don't mind putting a lot of money in the pot. If we then make it a jack, this is where things get interesting. And this is where the very big sizing comes into play. The board is not very wet, so we are not very concerned in the equities switching in the future to maybe the big blind's advantage in this case. Therefore, villain will now have turned some jack X. So specifically queens and kings, as you can see, this is the time to make money. Okay, they check the flop, waiting for villain to maybe turn a jack. This is the time to get the money in. We can see that there's a very clear profile with some hands always wanting to bet small. Those are like your pocket 8s, your pocket 9s, your pocket 10s. Okay, they still want to get thin value versus a 7 and a 6. Remember, he checked that quite often on the flop, but it doesn't want to bet too big because sometimes he will have a jack, but it just wants to deny equity of, for example, king 10. I assume king 10 is folding. Okay, king 10 is even not appealing. Queen 10, you get the point, like around this region, right? And that's again why, for example, aces will sometimes check again, right? And then there's a medium sizing being invented, and that's mainly for the jack 10s, the jack 10 type of holdings. And the huge sizing is for our overpairs, okay? And our overpairs were not very interested in the flop yet because it wanted to wait if the turn was not like a 3 to a 9, I guess. It wasn't, so now it's time to go direction all in. So we make a big overbet. Villain can actually already fold a jack some of the time, but it still has to call. I would say in practice, for example, I end like 7-4. I would say in practice, this line is definitely overfolded. Okay, everyone is now going crazy. But hey, I think it works. And then basically on the river, let's say if the river, because an advantage also of the very big bet, and we will see that more in a different example that I will use on a flush draw board, is that, for example, let's say he has 5-4. Okay, 5-4 is actually still calling at some frequency. 8-9 as well. So where's the gutter? Gutter, 10-8. He's folding out a lot of the gutters. So let's say river is a 9. 5-8 he could have. Let's see actually what happens if the river is a 9. We could probably still go all in with our overpairs against a jack. Yeah. So we mainly jam with our overpairs. And basically we put him in a very tough spot. Okay, so when going for delay and when trapping, maybe I should have also mentioned this in the slow playing webinar that I gave. When you slow play, it's very important to make up for the slow playing on a later street. And I think this is a great example. Okay, If you would go 3/4, you've clearly missed the point. Yeah, turn a6, that's where we're going now. So that's a jack. The turn ace is quite interesting. Because we see the same, okay? We still have this huge sizing because we have the equity advantage in ace king and ace queen, which the big blind doesn't have. A6 and a7 is quite divided. We probably have more sets than he does because he never checks back a set, but we could definitely check a set. So the nut advantage is there. Therefore, we have a very big sizing. The medium sizing, remember on that jack example, was designed for a jack. As you can see here, a medium sizing is not really a thing because there's no hand class that was a jack. The small sizing is still there because we're still interested in betting this region, okay? 8s, 9s, and 10s, because they want to get some value out of 6s and 7s. And again, if they bet small, which they dominantly want, they just want to fold out like this part of Vinen's range, okay? Which has 2 overs versus our hand. And yeah, that's kind of how the different turns play. I will now go into any questions about this board. I will now go into a sort of similar board. I think it's a 9-7-5 two-tone. And then we'll go to the queen 10-7 and then to an ace king 5. Any more questions about this one particularly? In game on a board like this against population, when you have the opportunity to late c-bet on the turn, how do you choose between sizes with bluffs? So basically, the bigger you go, the more equity your hand usually has. The smaller you go, the more you can just throw out something random. For example, here we're betting a lot with 8s, 9s, 10s, everything for a small sizing. If you look at the big betting range, okay, it usually is an open-ender, a flush draw. There's very little complete bananas in there, okay? So usually if you have a very good draw, you can add that to the big betting range. And if you have a medium hand, you can add that to the small betting range. This is literally also what the bet size is designed for, okay? Also, you can look at, for example, maybe Jack 10 here. It's not really showing, but I would say Jack 10 kind of blocks ace 10 and ace jack, which are the strongest ace x villain can have in his range. So I would say that Jack 10, oh, he even has sometimes ace queen. So then I would say Jack queen, if he has ace queen. Yeah, so Jack queen, we can see here, sometimes goes for that big bet. That's also an heuristic you can use. So basically what you're trying to do with your bluff sizing is you're trying to put your hand into a sizing for which it has effective blockers. So in this case, if you would go 275% pot, his dominant calling range will be ace jack, ace queen. So therefore, queen jack is best used in a very big sizing compared to in a small sizing. Whereas, for example, if we bet small with Jack 8 probably blocks like some 8-7 that he checked back, some ace 8. And these will always call a small sizing. So therefore, we can use it maybe in your small bet strategy. All right. Let me go to the next example. 9-7-5. C-bet frequency will decrease on the flop compared to the 7-6 deuce because there's more gutters. So now a 6 and an 8 is directly bad for our hand, whereas on the 7-6 deuce it was in the future bad for our hand. And there's a flush draw, which means that, let's say we value bet 10 with a 5 or a 7. There's more turns that basically we can be dead on. Okay, whereas on a rainbow board, you're rarely dead on the turn. Okay, because he doesn't turn a hand as strong as a flush. So again, the wider the board, the more we check. Turn deuce, we will see similar patterns as on the 7-6 deuce. And now actually we will see a huge overbet as well, which actually we did not really see on the other example. Now, why would that be? Why would we suddenly have a 275%? And on the 7-6 deuce, turn 3, turn, what was the other turn? That wasn't really the case. I'm gonna spoiler it. No responses. Vin is more capped in this spot. So Not really. Like I said, it's a solver. If you look at this check back range, most probably is sometimes checking back maybe like a 2-pair hand. No, mainly betting. Straights probably also mainly betting, I would say. What is a straight? 6-4. Actually, it's sometimes even checking back 6-4. So it's not completely capped. It's checking back quite a lot of 9x, quite a lot of 8x, 7x. Range advantage, yes, that's why we had a big bet. But why does it go so big? Well, I'll spoiler it. It's mainly to fold out draws. So it can actually now start folding out a hand like 8-9. So yes, a flush river. Actually, this is already this example. For example, Jack 3 of diamonds is sometimes folding. Jack 4 of diamonds is folding. 10-4 of diamonds is folding. So it can actually, usually on a wet board, you size down because there's a lot of cards that can come on a future street that will change the equities. But because we now have the 275% option, we can actually fold out those hands. So even if the river is now a flush, he will have already folded a lot of flush draws on the turn. Okay. It's mainly, I think, the weaker ones that is already folding. So I thought that was quite cool. And in the meanwhile, we just get called by a 9. So in this case, protection versus a flush draw, it's actually possible if we give it a 275. If you don't have the 275, we will probably want to slow down a little bit. So I thought that was pretty interesting. I never had 275% on the turn in my sims. So yeah, I saw this. I was like, hey, that's actually pretty cool. So another point we saw on the 7-6 deuce deuce, we saw the protection, right? The small thin value bets with protection with ace king, with low pairs. Here, these have disappeared. And that's again because of the wetness of the board. On 7-6 deuce deuce or 7-6 deuce 3, there's less. Vinland's continue range will contain less equity versus our bet, and there's less rivers that will switch the equities. So we're more interested in building a pot on the 7-6 deuce deuce, 7-6 deuce 3 rainbow than we are in a 9-7-5 deuce. Okay, and sometimes people have the opposite intention. For example, when the board is double flush draw, they actually tend to bet more, or when there's a flush, they bet more because they want protection. Remember, it doesn't work like that. The wetter the board, the more we slow down. If this board is completely rainbow, okay, so actually let's make it, we now check 67. And if we make it completely rainbow, I'm gonna laugh if it's not different. Oh, it's different. Oh, now I don't really have a good explanation for this. This is probably, yeah, this is an exception of the rule apparently. Usually, if the board is rainbow and completely dry, we will use bigger sizings and get bet more often than when the board is wet. Except for this spot somehow. Don't ask me why. Yeah. So for example, if you probably look at the c-bet line in this spot, this will be the case, what I just explained to you guys. But going back to the board that I initially had, 7-5 deuce. No, so let's look at an 8. I find this one pretty interesting as well. 7-5-8. And if we look at our delayed c-bet strategy now, we can actually see that, well, first of all, we never really want to bet big because then we're isolating ourselves against a straight. Villain will have quite a lot of straights, so that's obviously not great. We do actually bet a lot small. And this is actually a concept on very connected boards where there's one card to a straight or even 2 cards to a straight. So let's say 9-8-7-6, or mono boards that we still do a lot of small betting. And that's because everything in Villain's range now has equity. If the river is a 6, even ace deuce splits against our aces, or ace maybe not a good example, but for example, we're interested in value betting pocket queens because ace 4 or ace deuce now has more equity than it has on a blank. Okay, on let's say, for example, a 3. All right, because we have split equity that we can now fold out. So that was pretty interesting. Most probably on a queen, we will see something similar with the very big bets. Again, we see the medium to slight overbet coming in, mainly designed for a queen. The small bet is still in there. Again, maybe for probably pocket tens. Apparently it's still good enough for 75. If we make it an ace, we can again see that medium sizing being less dominant. Okay. And now pocket tens, for example, again wants to go for the block, and 9 wants to go for a block. And we have that over bet with the ace king type of holdings. Things change a lot. 200 BB deep. If you don't have time, I can look it later. 200 BB deep, like I said, the higher the SPR, the more we want to slow down. So you're probably not going to make that 275% on the turn, because in position at a higher SPR is not going to fold a flush draw. Okay. So therefore, he's going to always call with a flush draw. And therefore, we probably want to slow down again. In general, the deeper you are, the more you slow down when the board becomes wet. Okay. I wanted to now look at the Queen 10-7. Again, if this board is rainbow on the flop, you can basically just range bet. On two-tone, there's definitely quite a lot of checks involved. I have it set on an ace. I'm not really sure why. I want to usually start at a blank. So there's a very big difference. This was the other concept that I wanted to show you. So on this turn, it's not really that protection is needed. Let's say, for example, the turn is a deuce. You could make the argument that we're trying to bet certain hands like Jack 10, for example, or 10-9. We want to protect against ace highs, right? Ace highs are probably going to be the dominant hand that Vin is going to fold to a bet, a very big part of his range. But now the turn is an ace, and we actually see that we're betting a hand like Queen Jack, for example, or a hand like Queen 9. And this is a very big difference between in position play and out of position play. Let me actually go straight to the in position sim. That's probably this one. Because when we're in position, we see no small betting, and Queen Jack and Queen 9 are dominantly checking. Whereas here, we can see way more small betting. Why is that? Why out of position, we're more interested in betting Queen 9, Queen Jack for a small sizing, and in position, we can just check. So here you can see, remember I said out of position, we will be doing more depolarized betting than in position. Let's see if you guys have been paying attention. So here we can see the in position, no small betting. The out of position, small betting. Queen 9 wants to see a river. In position raise facing check raise. Yeah, okay, but out of position. So he says, yeah, we don't want to bet in position because we can get check raised, but out of position, if we bet, we can also get raised, right? Queen 9 wants to see a river. I agree. They both want to see a river. In position, though, has the option to just check. Out of position, we might get bluffed off our hand if we check. I think if we check and Willem bets, out of position can realize equity and get called by worse. In position doesn't benefit from realizing by betting and get check raised. So the check raise part is indeed a reason why we don't bet, but obviously not the only reason. This is what I exactly said when the difference between in position and out position. We have to compare the EV of, because obviously we would like to just see a river, right, with Queen 9. Well, because we're out of position, we have to now compare the EV of we bet and get called or raised. We check and Willem checks. We check and Willem bets. And that's the thing we don't have to take in consideration when we're in position. So then the EV, the option becomes quite clear. And that's where, yeah, the EV of checking is probably higher in position because we 100% get to realize our equity. And when we're out of position, we don't get to 100% realize our equity. Someone said get bluffed off our hand. So let's say we check. In position bets 3/4. Oh, no, wait. He goes for an overbet. Did I say that correctly? No, 3/4. Because obviously we're not going to fold Queen Jack. But you can see that Queen 9 is actually already starting to become indifferent. Okay. So apparently, because of this reason, he's taking, before the solver calculated the bet check, he already saw that, okay, if we check, he's going to bet very little, actually, 27% of the time. And then we are indifferent with Queen 9. I don't want that. Therefore, I think betting is also a decent option. Okay, Queen Jack is never folding, so his realization is always going to be 100%. But apparently, it sees some merit in betting compared to checking as well. Okay, So this is the main. So we will do more betting when we're out of position than when we're in position. All right, that was kind of the main point that I wanted to make on this board. Again, in terms of the big overbets, I saw that here as well. Here you can see a very clear split between small bet, big bet, which I think in a lot of spots in poker you see in solvers. I personally always play from a small bet, big bet split strategy because I think it makes a lot of sense. Because a lot of hands just want to bet thinly for value and get some protection, like, for example, the Jack 10. And obviously, you have the hands that have another advantage, like your kings and aces. Now, we talked about in the slow playing section why King Queen and Ace Queen, they're basically the same hand. But King Queen is betting and Ace Queen is sometimes checking. And that's, again, realization of the folding range. Hitting is going to fold off Ace X if we bet. And if we have Ace Queen, a lot of Ace X are dead. If we have King Queen, Ace X is not dead. All right. So I thought this split was pretty cool. And again, I thought the really big overbet was really cool. This actually, I don't think I've ever faced a 275% delay overbet. So definitely, I think something cool to implement in your game. I will definitely start experimenting with it. And again, this was the example that I gave that, for example, 8-5 of hearts now is forced to fold. So I think that's pretty cool. Open-enders are even forced to fold, or at least the Jack 9. So now if the river is a flush after we bet at 275%, let me see, even a king high flush is folding. No, and over is the flipping point. Jack 6 is folding. So now if river actually is a flush, you will have a flush less often than if you would have betted small. So let's say, for example, 8 of hearts river is horrible when you bet any other sizing than 275%. But now the 8 of hearts river, he has less flushes. He doesn't have the straight as often. So it's actually pretty cool. Okay. And then again, like on a lot of rivers, we basically continue jamming. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, I haven't checked it out yet, but I saw Corleone talked about, I think it was last week or the week before, about river C betting. So I'm sure he talked about the difference between a blank, where we just basically bet for value all in and that's it. And when shit completes like a 9, we will also start to have smaller bet sizings in a range. We start to split, but I assume he talked about that. All right. The last board I wanted to look at out of position is the Ace King 5. Now, this is a board on the flop where in Wizard, it bets 33%. If you allow it to min bet, it will sometimes want to do that, especially on Rainbow. And a lot of them, especially also on a board like Ace Jack 5. But Ace King 5 two-tone, I think, was a good example of just a polarized strategy. And on the turn, on all the other boards, we saw the incentive to bet small. We don't see this on these type of boards because villain will have a lot of Ace X and protection is less needed. So if we have a king, we don't really have to get protection from 9-10, for example, right? Whereas on the other boards, the folding range had more equity versus our hand. If a king here bets, is basically isolating themselves versus an ace, which villain is going to check behind quite often. So all you would do with a king is just bet for the sake of betting. And you don't want to bet for the sake of betting. Everything you do needs to have a certain purpose, a certain reason behind it. Okay. So therefore, we continue depolarizing, being very polarized on these type of textures. Okay. I actually, here actually doesn't use the 275. I honestly don't really know why, because the range construction is still that we have a huge advantage and he has worse hands. So if we look at it, I think very simple, look how much best hands we have and how much good hands we have. I didn't really get it. Also, if we bet very big, we will see similar tendencies as on the other boards, that he's folding a flush draw, he's folding gut shots. So if anyone could inform me why here we don't the late C bet 275, it's still calling with a lot of the ace X, majority of ace X, so that's actually also not it. It's not like the 8 improved his range that much. So yeah, beats me. Like I checked on multiple turns, it's like, I don't know, here it's coming in a little bit, but maybe because he's folding a king. Yeah, but I mean, a king. So basically, if we have ace queen, we want to get value out of worse ace. Try turn reports. Yeah, I didn't see that many turns where this is the case. So I thought that That was pretty interesting. Like it's very low. On the 7 or 6 that we just selected, it's the highest, but it's not as high as in the other examples where I feel like the spot is quite similar. So yeah, I'm not really 100% sure why that's the case. But I mean, the trend is still we want to overbet check mainly. Okay. So those were for out of position. Anyone have a question for out of position? Because then we're going to move on to how these boards play in position. Or maybe I will go over in position and then we'll just round up with some questions. About the board before 975 deuce, isn't it very hard to construct a strategy with this many bet sizings and even the 275 make him fold flush shots? How would you simplify it? So I would always simplify towards two sizing strategies. Like I said, big bet, small bet. It's actually a good question that you asked. Let me go back to, for example, the 975. It was turn deuce, right? I don't think there was that many sizings in this case. So usually you want to limit yourself to two sizings, in my opinion. A deuce, yeah, actually, so a deuce was quite simple. You could just, if I look at this, okay, it's dominantly wanting to overbet. So I would probably lean towards just using a big size, like 150, 175-ish. Or you could also only bet 275. That's fine as well. If you probably run a sim with only 275, it will do that with maybe 15% of his range. Like I said, because the board is so connected, we're less interested in betting small. But I think if you would make like small bet, very big bet, that's a fine split. Like I said, you could play check 150, but then you kind of miss some of the benefits that we just spoke about. Yeah, 275 check. I personally like that as well, also because it's a low board and it's a spot where if you where people small first big blind, especially on a low board, if you check two people twice, they can become quite stabby. So I usually like to play from a lot of check, and I don't really, for example, I don't really see a lot of incentive to bet 10-9 because people will often start betting worse hands themselves. People can start bluffing. So I like the check with 10-9. So that would be a big bet check would be my guideline. However, for example, in the way I just explained, this is already answered. Let's say, for example, you play versus a passive opponent, whereas if you check, you're not inducing anything, then obviously you should start implementing a smaller sizing as well. Okay. But yeah, usually stick with, I think the interesting one was it a jack? That there was a three sizing strategy invented? Yeah, so the jack was quite interesting, but I think this one can come quite intuitively. Like I said, no, usually I don't really do it, but when you think about your bet sizing, you're trying to think about, okay, like I said, need for protection, range advantage. You're thinking about your value range and which sizing your value hands want to bet. Well, we here have like some 7x, some 8s and 9s that clearly want to bet small. Okay. We have some kings that clearly want to bet huge. And then you have some jack 10s that are sort of in the middle. Now you could, again, just remove all the middle sizings from half pot to 175 and just play block and 275. I think that's fine. And then probably some of these jack X hands will go to check or block. And the ace jack will just bet 275 more often. That's fine. But I do think it feels quite intuitive if you think from your value range perspective. Usually the bet sizings will then follow. So even though I don't use a three sizing split all that often, I might do it on check call check bet lines, big blind versus button. But it's not like I have it in my mind like, oh, I'm going to always play a three sizing betting strategy. The three sizing betting strategy comes more up when there's suddenly a lot of hands that also want to bet medium. Okay, like I said, I usually play small and very big. But suddenly if there's a very big part of your range that want to bet medium, I think intuitively it can make sense. But like I said, if it doesn't come intuitive to you, then I would definitely not recommend trying to force and implement it. Just stick with a two sizing strategy, or possibly even one on that low board on the 975 that we just discussed. So I hope that makes sense. So moving on to in position, 7-6 deuce. We check back. And we can actually see something similar. We actually have protection bets in position. That's not very common. And this is because, remember what I said, that out of position is less inclined to slow play than in position. So the amount of strong hands that villain will no, wait, I'm saying this wrong. No, I'm saying this wrong. I'm saying this wrong. The board just plays very similar. The board just plays very similar. Because we have a need for protection versus mainly this checking range. So if we look at the big blind, it's going to be, again, the main checking range is going to be in this area. So let's say and he's already very incentivized here. You can see he's betting most 7x. He's betting quite a lot of 6x as well. So then if we have, for example, a hand like pocket fives, we don't mind betting for like some thin value, some protection. Okay. Now, someone also asked me about double delay, when to delay again. Well, this has everything to do with looking ahead of your EV in the future. So let's say we have our thin value bet. So these are usually the hands. Okay. In order to value bet, we have to size down, meaning that the EV isn't that high. Okay. So what are some things that could lead a thin value bet to become a check? Okay. When would we be more interested in checking again with ace 10 or pocket fives or with 6-8 or with, yeah, kind of the thin value hands? When would checking become better than betting thin for value? I already spoiled it in the, if we dominate the river pair villain can make. Yeah, so that's the reason why, for example, ace 9, that and the fact that ace 9 is just a stronger hand. That's why, for example, king, queen, and ace 9, those are the main hands that check for those reasons. Less draws might make them check more. Less draws might make them check more. Now, I would say it's more draws. So, for example, spoiler alert, on a 9-7-5 two-tone, he will check more 5-7 9x to us, and therefore we cannot bet as thin anymore for protection and thin value. So the main reason was in the downsides of delayed c-betting were we let villain realize its equity. So this has already been addressed by Donald Duck. We dominate the river pairs and we grant him playability. But what is he going to do with his playability? If people overbluff the river, okay, we might even want to not delay Jack 4 now, but wait until the river and bluff raise him, for example. Okay. But if people overbluff the river and check, check, bet, we just want to check pocket fives, close our eyes and call. Let me see. I'm just checking if the board cannot be counterfeited and then we call it 5 high and loose. But no, that's not the case. So if villain significantly overbluffs the river, we always want to check pocket fives, close our eyes and call. If you're going to check versus someone who overbluffs the river and then fold the river, that's a horrible mistake. If someone is very passive, we always want to delay small with these hands because we don't induce anything on the river. Okay. So someone asked me, or on some other boards, yeah, when people are just very imbalanced and we can just move a lot of our delayed bluffs to the river because villain is not going to be aggressive. So if people, let's say the Jack 4 again, if you're against a very passive player that on the river is not going to bluff you, then we can wait until the river and wait till he checks because the betting range is not going to contain enough bluffs. So therefore we gain EV. How do we gain EV? By folding versus that range. And when he checks, bluff the river. Okay. We gave him an opportunity to bluff us, but if he doesn't do that, okay, and we can still delay bluff the river, we can use that line with bluffs as well. So like I said, but these are very exploitive things. So, but it's basically exploit. If you understand the theory, then we can start exploiting. So if we then go again to the 5, similar concept as in position, we will have a little bit less protection sort of bet with these holdings. Only ace king is left. Now, for example, some of these hands that were in this region now also have a pair plus draw. So that's something that's quite interesting. Not a lot of big bets. If we look at the Jack, and this is also a very big difference, we were over betting 275% pot on a similar board run out small versus big blind. Now we don't do that here, okay? Because out of position, is going to check still quite a lot of strong hands, like sets 6, 7. As you can see, they're checking quite a lot. Whereas if we were in position was not checking back these hands. Okay, so on the turn we had a huge range advantage. Now, within the reason we cannot size very big is also the reason or the times that we can size very big. So if people have unbalanced checking ranges and they just bet strong, check weak, we can again just bet 250% pot. Okay. This is actually something that I talked about in the slow play section, right? The reason why we slow play certain hands is to handcuff our opponent. If we don't have slow plays in this section, in position can just bet the size of his hand, which his hand actually wants to do, which over pairs are now going to be the 250% most likely. Okay. So yeah, those were the main points I wanted to make on this board. Check 9, 7, 5. So yeah, less small bets, what I said, because of the fact that the continued raise will have more equity. And here we can see that the big blind checks way more 7x than it, so way more middle pairs in this region. And where's the other 7x? 7, 8 in this region than on the other board. So therefore, when we check, we are also less interested in betting thin with like a 7 ourselves. Right, where we were thin betting medium pair, ace king on a board that was drier. So again, the wetter the board, the less interested we are in building a pot and betting thin for value. You can clearly see that coming back here. Let's say turn is a queen. Again, we will probably be restricted a little bit in terms of our sizing, 3/4 being the dominant one. Okay, and that's again because out of position is not as capped as in position. Because again, pocket 7s often checking, maybe hand like 7, 5, 7, 9. It's still checking a lot of strong hands towards us. Therefore, usually when you're in position, we are a bit capped in terms of how big we can size. Okay, this goes for bet check bet lines in position and delayed C bet lines in position. All right. Queen 10, 7. We already discussed that one. I already went ahead of myself. Mainly, I was interested in the turn ace. Also, a turn blank is actually quite interesting. Big blind, again, is going to check towards us quite often. Again, where the queen is going to choose a more polarized strategy. That's because the check back, like, again, if you're here with pocket 8s and you want to bet for protection, your equity when called is just too bad because in position checks back way too much queen x, 10x for you to be able to bet for protection. Now, obviously, you can bet for protection, 33. You see, he's folding out an ace. But your equity when called is very bad. Okay. So therefore, we use a polarized strategy. Vin is checking a lot of queens, which means that we cannot bet very thin. So we're not really going to bet a 10. And then the sizing that rolls out. Again, I'm thinking, okay, what are the hands that we want to bet? Well, we mainly want to bet a queen. So the sizing that then rolls out is an overbet. So this was actually one of the exceptions where we were still using big bets, not as big, okay? Because again, big blinds should be sometimes trapping. Pocket 7s, for example, 10-7, probably something like, yeah, mainly I would say 10-7 makes quite a lot of sense. 10-7, pocket 7s, queen 7. Queen 7. All right. So therefore, we cannot go too big. Okay. The last board is the ace king 5, which again plays very similar. We don't really have a lot of incentive to be betting medium that often. We can see king queen sometimes betting small. And again, for example, king queen is sometimes trying to sneak out a little half pot bet. Okay. As soon as your opponent is not balanced on the river, the EV of check will go up. So in terms of going double delay, the better or the clearer EV decision you have on the river, yeah, the more you want to build your strategy around getting to the river. Okay. It's sometimes betting these half pots because if it checks again, most probably it will sometimes be in a 0 EV situation on the river and he doesn't really want that. Okay. So these were all the examples that I gave. I think I discussed everything. Are there any more questions before we wrap things up? I think I discussed most type of textures. Monotone boards. Monotone boards, they're even wetter. So if we just follow the philosophy, the wetter the board, the more we slow down. That's mono boards, unless, so okay, maybe I'll quickly click a mono board here in for you. So let's say it's, so no big sizings, usually slowing down for both players. Unless, so let's say, for example, turn is a 6, some connectivity, mono, not great, so no overbets, very high checking frequency, okay? We want to play a small pot because the boards often go to change. The interesting part, though, is that if on another mono comes, we still actually bet quite a lot, and that's because, again, any hand if in its range now has equity. Are we destroyed because over nuts and no. So our nuts are not in the overbetting range. So to go back to like 975, if you look at our delay betting range, straight set, over pair, top pair, under pair. Oh wait, we're actually in the wrong. I mean, this is if we would construct. So here we do construct. Okay, here we do construct. So people often are a little bit paranoid when it comes down to small sizings, in terms of that they often have to put in a lot of the weekends in the small sizing. The main hand you usually see going in the small sizing is the hand class 6s, because it unblocks a 7 and a jack. So basically, if we bet very big, 275, right, which our strong hands mainly want to do, we're trying to get value out of a 7 and a jack. If we bet small, okay, let's say we go small, a jack is going to raise himself. So we're not losing any value. Okay, so if you unblock the raising range, that's usually the hand that you want to include in your block slow play type of holding. But when we want their delay, let's remove the filters. So when we want their delay, how do we play rivers? Well, we follow it up with a lot of betting. And probably even depending, and again, the wetter the river, the more we size down, the cleaner the river, the less we size down. So let's say it's the 3 is pretty clean. We can see that now, medium sizing, so pocket 8s, queen 7, what's our bottom? 9-7, for example, we can just bet for 60% pot. Okay. Big difference between, yeah, so aces, if you don't understand this concept, watch back the slow playing, but that's because if we bet, a lot of the hands that are going to fold are the ace-x. Okay, ace-x have equity versus kings and queens, and they have no equity versus aces. Probably also sometimes it has something to do with the calling range. Yeah, Finland sometimes calls ace-7, ace-6, and ace-deuce as hero calls, so that's also something that we're blocking. If you want to see more of this concept, watch back my slow playing section. Usually, yeah, then because also if you block the turn, some jacks here are already raising. Let's say, for example, you would block the river again. Most jack X will now have raised by the river. So you don't really lose any value, okay? Because now if he raises, you can come over the top and still can get your stack in. That's why usually a hand category like pocket 7s or pocket 6s doesn't mind blocking, if you want to add a weekend or a very strong hand to your blocking range. All right, thank you guys, and good luck at the table. See you next month.